Check, 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 check. I'm just gonna check on my laptop. Check, 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 stream audio, check, stream audio, check, stream audio. Checking the stream audio. Stream check audio. Checking the stream audio. Check this microphone, checking this microphone for the stream. 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 Checking this microphone for the string. Testing this microphone for the stream. No, it wouldn't. You tried? Oh no, it is there. Oh yeah, yeah. Checking. Checking. Checking, checking. Check for the stream. Check for the stream. Checking for the stream. Checking on the stream. Checking on the stream. Checking on the stream. Checking for the stream. 112 112 112 112 112 112 112 112 112 112 112 1818181818181818. You can take one of these. Oh, yeah. It's working on the stream. I'm just going to set it up on the speaker. Can you hear me at the back? 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 Is the volume good at the back or should it be louder? Louder? How's the volume now? Louder? Should it be louder still? Louder still? How's How's it now? Louder still? It's okay. And then on this mic, louder still or is it good? Sorry, I have to fix the thing went down. No worries. There we go. Let me just check this. Okay, I think, and then let's start recording. Okay. It's all good. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started in a minute. So if everyone could take a seat. Okay, if everybody could find a seat, there's a few more here if you'd like a seat. I see some more over here at the back. Do you guys want to find a seat? Okay, everybody, welcome to Trajectory Labs. This is Toronto Tech Week, so there might be a few more new faces than usual. Raise your hand if this is your first time at Trajectory Labs. Okay, so quite a few. So Trajectory Labs is an AI safety nonprofit. We kind of are concerned about, and our mission is aligned with the most kind of large scale, the existential risks that AI poses. So our mission, the way that we fulfill like kind of our trying to mitigate these risks is through three things. One of the things that we do is events like these. So twice a week we have events where experts, researchers who are working on different aspects of AI safety come and present what they find new, interesting, and relevant to all of you, which is a mix of other AI safety researchers and practitioners, as well as just like the general interested public. We also operate a co-working space from 9 to 5 and after hours. So if you're someone who's interested in AI safety and you would find like a collaborative co-working space helpful in doing AI safety work, please talk to me, Mario, or Joanne at the back. We'd love to hear from you. We also facilitate kind of like a wider peer network, which is a little bit nebulous, but what that means is when a group local wants to do a fellowship like the TASY group is doing, or like a hackathon like some folks are doing upcoming that's policy-centric, we want to hear from those people because we want to help provide like the space and some of the logistical support to make those things happen. So with all of that being said, Trajectory Labs is a great place to be if you're interested in AI safety. Now to get onto the housekeeping. Usually we would collect questions via Slido, so we would use those QR codes all around. We're not going to do that today. Instead, I'm going to run around with mics. In order to make this work well, please raise your hand and then I'll like make eye contact with you in advance. So like if someone's asking a question, you can raise their hand while they're asking a question, and then I'll like make eye contact with you, and then I'll be able to bring the mic over really quickly at the end. The reason why we use the mics is not just so that people in the room can hear, but people who are watching on stream. It's pretty annoying if you're watching on stream and you don't know what the question was being asked, and then when Catherine gives her answer, you're not going to have the correct context for it. So just make sure, as the audience, we're speaking to the mics. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have to take a phone call at any point during the talk, that's totally fine. But please go to the back desk and ask me, Mario, or Joanne to escort you to a room, because if you try to go down any hallway, we will be able to hear your call. It'll be disruptive, and you also don't want us to hear what your call is. If you need to use the bathroom at any point, you can go through those glass doors and to the right. I believe that is all of my housekeeping notes, so I'm going to pass it off to Catherine. Let's get a round of applause for Catherine. Hello?
In your hands. Okay. Thanks, Georgia. Hi, everybody. Great to see such a large crowd coming out to Trajectory Labs. The talk today is about regulatory markets. This is not my work, which is always great because substantive criticism is directed at somebody else. But this is me. I'm a senior associate for AI governance at the Future Society. This is a nonprofit working globally in the EU and the US to try to convince policymakers and relevant stakeholders to take the most serious risks from AI seriously and do something about it. And so I try to influence that with my background as a lawyer. So I primarily work on the EU AI Act and adjacent EU legislative frameworks. I have a small mandate here in Canada as well, as we pursue somewhat of an AI middle power strategy as well, and in my volunteer capacity as the policy lead of AI Governance and Safety Canada as well. So if any of that interests you further, let me know, but let's get into the fun substance of today's talk. So this is the agenda. Generally, the proposal that the authors of this paper are putting forward is trying to address a gap in the AI governance space. And so we'll start a little bit with what the current approach is, then what regular markets do, how they address this gap, how they generate regulatory capacity, which is like the competitive market aspect of this proposal, how they intend to apply this to frontier AI governance, and whether they do so successfully. Okay, so as I said, we're trying to govern AI better. It's a collective goal here. And so let's understand first how that is currently being approached. So this is generally how this works, that you have very high level laws that simply say something like you have to do risk classification and mitigation, that it sets principles on a very high level and then leaves it to standard bodies where you have domain experts to work out the nitty-gritty. These come usually in two flavors. One would be process-driven standards that set out what a risk mitigation system is supposed to look like exactly. So details such as you have to set up an AI policy and AI principles. You have to do impact assessments on human rights and human values and all those sorts of things. And then the second flavor would be the truly technical standards that then translate those requirements into specific measurable thresholds that can be subjected to third-party audits. Okay, so this is very, very normal. But the risk that the issue that we run into is presented here in the footers. So first of all, high-level laws are obviously and kind of by design technically unspecific. Fairness is just a statement that they require, and we don't really know what that means. Process-driven standards have some technical detail. It's mostly still left to technical standards, so it's not very operationalizable yet, at least not down to the detail. And then for technical standards, well, that's a great vision. We don't really have that for AI so much because this is quite nascent technology. So that's where we're at. And then what we have seen on the left two boxes was basically what the authors call the technical deficit, right? There's just not enough technical detail to inform the operationalization of these standards. And that's also a problem with those process-driven standards, as I said. Okay, so the usual process then was to delegate this to technical standard committees, but they come with a second problem, namely that you have the democratic deficit. Okay, so if a legislative body sets a law, then you have public accountability of those regulators, but you miss the technical detail. The technical detail you get from standards bodies, but there's no public accountability on that level because these standard bodies are generally equipped with industry experts that essentially set their own standards. So they would be defining themselves what risk mitigation should look like. And they obviously have an incentive to set those standards in a way that they can comply with them fairly easily and without many resources needing to be poured into that. And so the lack of accountability is really problematic on that point. And so while this can work in other legal domains, if you, for example, try to standardize, say, airplanes or steam boilers in the old days, then that's maybe fine because there is little democratic agreement necessary. We all don't want boilers to explode and planes to not fall from the air. And so that's perhaps okay, but in the context of AI, they're really value-laden judgments that you need to make and that you then transcribe into technical standards. So that's really problematic. So for example, to remain with the example I used earlier, the fairness requirement, if you try to put that in some sort of measurable metric that you can assess an AI system's output on, then you have made a value-laden judgment, which the authors, I think, rightly claim should be left to governments to make. What kind of threshold of fairness do we want the AI system's output to adhere to? So what counts as discriminatory in the first place, for example, and where do these trade-offs between efficiency and fairness lie? Okay, so these are essentially political questions that the technical standard bodies are simply by design not meant to address. So to put this in a bit of a flow chart, where we have on the vertical axis the democratic accountability and then the technical deficit on the horizontal axis, the command and control, so the standard model where you have the legislator regulate on a high level, it's democratic, but it's not sufficiently technical for the system designers and developers to know what they're supposed to do. And then you have high technical specificity when it comes to technical standards. At least we might still get there at some point with AI. Don't have it right now, but that's a possibility. And certainly something we should also work on, I think. And so the regulatory markets, the proposal we'll discuss today, is trying to fill this gap where you have high accountability at the same time as you also have technical detail that the developers know what to do with, essentially. Okay? Everything clear so far? If you ask yourself, but how? Then that's coming, but so far so good. Cool. Okay, so this slide is setting out how the model that the authors propose is supposed to work. You essentially have three actors. You have governments. They sit at the top of this chain. Government would still be the one that sets some target or goal that defines what regulation is supposed to achieve. And then they license the middle actor, the second actor, the private regulators or regulatory service providers, as they are called, the RSPs. These are private companies. They could be for-profit or non-profit, and they would compete in a market to provide their regulatory services to the third entity here, which is the target of regulation, actually, the AI companies. And the AI companies are required by law to purchase these regulatory services. So that's sort of like a second role that government plays. They have to implement a law that requires these AI companies to purchase regulatory services. Okay. So because multiple RSPs compete for the same clients, they have a commercial incentive then to develop better and cheaper methods for achieving compliance. So this is the market-driven aspect here that I'll go into a lot more detail later, but that's really important. Okay, so these private regulators could employ very conventional means of governance. They could write text-based rule. They could be responsible for fining for a violation that they assess when compliance is not a given. But they can also develop what the authors call regulatory technology. That's obviously not a new term, and it's something that is being developed in private at the AI companies themselves, but not really so much in the public sector or on the free market. Okay, the AI companies can choose which regulator they want to be overseen by, and they can switch. But because it's mandated by the government to have, to subject yourself to this market, they can't opt out of it. That's the vision, okay? So that's basically what gives the system teeth and differentiates it from industry self-regulation. Now you have these three examples on the bottom of what kinds of goals or targets the government could set. So examples that the authors are considering is it could be a metrics-based threshold where they could say the AI system has to be able to have a fraud rate below X% on AI-powered transactions. So you think of an AI system deployed in the financial market, for example, it can't fall below this. That's one example of what the government could do to set these goals. The second one would be principled based, so a little more akin to what we see in the general command and control regulation today, where it could say something like hiring AI must achieve demonstrable non-discrimination across protected groups. And then it's up to the private regulator to figure out how they want to refine that, essentially. Or it could be safety-based, where the standard that the government sets is that frontier models must not increase non-state actors' capacity to produce bioterror agents. I have a slide on how that specific example is supposed to pan out, so if that's not clear right away, fair enough, that's coming. So these are obviously metrics of different specificity, but there's still some meaningfulness behind it. So discrimination as the term, for example, is backed by case law, right? So it's not sort of like completely in a vacuum, but it is still left to the private regulators then to figure out what works and what doesn't. And then the government can say yay or nay, no? So the private regulator proposes a method of assessing this, and then the government can say, yeah, that works for us, you get a license, you are licensed in our jurisdiction to oversee or to offer your regulatory services to the AI company that operates in our jurisdiction. Questions? Sorry, if you could wait for the mic, it's coming your way.
Hi, the question I have is, why is private regulators or like a private regulatory mechanism a better form of institutional allocation compared to like a SOC 2 or a compliance oriented certificate? And what are the incentives for private regulators outside of market forces? Because I imagine the scope of research that it entails to be an effective private regulator, which is if I have the capabilities to build out the technical explainability frontiers and like define success based criteria, as a commercial actor, I would much rather go after the market, the commercial market, rather than the regulatory market. So I'm curious if there are unique
Perfect.
legal advantages that being a private regulator affords.
Yeah, great questions, both of those. So essentially, the idea here is that we want to create an entirely new market that doesn't exist yet, right? Currently, if you have those skills, you'll go to the frontier companies because that's where the skill is useful, that's where it can be applied. Even if you're safety minded, you could be on the red team or something, right? So the idea is to create an entirely new market through this legal framework where you require the AI companies to subject yourself to a private regulator. And then the hope is that this kind of market would then attract VC money, right? Because these skills are so highly valuable, there would be investments, hopefully of an equal scale to AI companies, because we're also in favor of safety and reliability and all these sorts of things. So that's generally the hope there. And then you can hopefully see the incentive of why you want to be a private regulator rather than working at, say, Anthropic or something, because you do get to work with them really closely. You likely have NDAs, so you get insights into what they're doing. But you're kind of like the good guys, if you will. Okay, so that's, I think, the thought behind it. I talk a bit more about the incentives and how this works throughout as well, but I think this was a good primer for us right now. One more?
Yeah, perhaps kind of related. I'm wondering what would prevent an AI company from just sort of spinning out an RSP that would be sort of favorable to their own interests, or perhaps heavily investing in an RSP that they felt would maybe be more amenable to their perspective.
Yeah. So I think the questions of independence of the regulators is crucial and one that has to be closely monitored. I think the way you can address that with the most sort of like sharp mechanism is that governments don't allow it and you have oversight on what kind of relation you can have to the companies and those sorts of things. So that, I think that's possibly a way to address that and around like competition law, for example, and things like that. So I don't think this is a problematic thing that can't be addressed. But in general, you're certainly, I think, correct that much of the talent currently is, as we said, concentrated in the frontier companies. And so, but the idea too is that you want an incentive to pull them out essentially and put their skills to use as private regulators, and then you just need to make sure that there's no cheating or collusion going on, right? So there would be it's necessary that the government has the expertise and insight to really credibly revoke licenses or prevent market access from regulators that they don't think are trustworthy.
So I just want to go maybe a step before that. I know this is a presentation focused on EU law, but what about Canada? Like, I think where we are in Canada is that we're trying to figure out whether it should be domain specific type of regulation or an omni bill that covers everything. So I'm wondering, like, what's your perspective before we get into the licensing regime?
Yeah, so it's not at all EU specific actually. So the jurisdictions that they survey, and I'm leaving that out of the presentation, is very much US, UK, China, and the EU. They don't talk about Canada specifically so much, but I can tell you that so Hetfield, for example, is on the board of advisors for Fathom, and they are like very much pushing this in Canada as well, trying to gauge appetite in the Canadian jurisdiction. So it's supposed to be applicable very much broadly. So you could apply this regulatory market approach to any sectorial domain, or you can apply it to frontier model providers. And it could be a both and, right? Not an either or. It's just sort of like principally how we think about that. You can have private regulators that specialize in assessing the fairness in hiring mechanisms, or in accuracy in the healthcare sector or in the financial sector, right? So it's very much amenable to a sectorial approach. And they seem to think, we have to probe that a little bit, that it also works for generally capable systems and models. So we'll see that a little bit later on. Okay, move forward from here. So a little bit more to drive home that point of the benefits of these of this regulatory market. So aside from this abstract goal of addressing the technical and the democratic deficits, the benefits could be as follows. So first of all, they relate to developing better governance, right? So the government can't really invest in regulatory innovation the way that private firms can. Governments don't take risks. They don't compete. They can't attract the engineering talent that is needed to build really sophisticated governance tools. And so the public sector is just not designed for this kind of iterative technological development. The industry does, right? So we have internal teams at the AI companies that do very much invest into developing evals and control mechanisms and that sort of thing, but they are in service of corporate goals, not public ones. And also, a firm that develops these tools internally, they keep it proprietary. So it's not on the marketplace to be distributed, and there's no mechanism to force this investment in democratically guided tools, essentially. And so regulatory markets are intended to design a third incentive structures. The RSPs, the private regulators, they would compete on methodological quality. So if they can develop an evaluation, for example, that assesses risks better than some other competing regulator, then they gain market share. And so that drives the development of regulatory technology. But they, importantly, do not compete on the quality of their services for the benefit of achieving the goals, because the goals are set by government, and you can't get licensed unless you can prove that your approach meets that goal that governments set. So this competitive pressure then drives investment in the tools that government can't build and that industry has no reason to share, essentially. So yeah, the regulatory tools would remain private within the regulators, but they are hopefully many, is the vision, and they would compete to make them better. So they are not publicly available in that sense, but they are available to the AI companies that are obliged to pay and solicit these services. Okay, there's another benefit to this regulatory market approach that we haven't discussed yet. They claim that they can also sort of like show a path towards at least some international coordination. So if you had tapped into this discussion, a recurring frustration for AI governance is that there's a massive gap between the need for international coordination on AI governance approaches and the near impossibility of achieving that through conventional means. So treaty negotiations basically require states to agree on specific regulatory approaches and metrics, and that's really, really difficult given how different the approaches are that different jurisdictions are currently taking. And so it's really, really hard to achieve that kind of global coordination on a timeline that keeps pace with the development of the technology. Standard bodies do a little bit better, potentially, right? They have also multi-year timelines, but again, there's the democratic deficit that we see there, because the technical committees are generally dominated by industry. Okay, so regulatory markers, so the authors claim, offer a different mechanism to achieve harmonization, which is driven by market incentives. So I'm trying to explain how this diagram, which is just adapted from the actual paper, works. So essentially, the RSPs in the square boxes in the middle there, they seek licenses from multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. So you don't have to only do it in Canada or only in the US. You can do it in different jurisdictions and sort of like convince government that you are able to achieve the specific regulatory target that the governments might set, and that might very much differ. But you could be, as a single RSP, be able to satisfy different goals that different governments set. And then a company chooses a single RSP that manages to be licensed in multiple jurisdictions, and then they have access to all of those markets. Okay, and then so the second point there, governments align criteria to attract RSP. That's worth dwelling on, right? That's where the harmonization is happening. So governments wouldn't necessarily align their criteria out of principle, but they do so out of sort of economic interests. So if Canada, for example, licenses all 7 of these RSPs and Japan only licenses 6, then companies that have chosen the 7th RSP can only operate in Canada but not in Japan. And then there might be pressure on Japan to adjust or to broaden its goals, for example. So there would be that market pressure on Japan to align with Canada. So that's where that harmonization comes through this competitive dynamic. Deviation is possible also. So if you have a population that has a very different risk appetite or different values, then you are very much able as a government to set standards that you don't think that the commercial ISPs currently are able to achieve with their governance approaches. But you have that right. It just comes at the cost that you likely have a smaller market of ISPs and potentially fewer AI companies that are able to operate in your jurisdiction. Oops, that was too early. Hold on, my speaker notes are hidden. Okay. Oh yeah, and then the paper makes a really interesting point about smaller or less wealthy countries as well. So you can probably already appreciate that this process where jurisdictions license operators, that's where the hard work lies, right? That's where you still need a lot of technical expertise at the government level. But say Canada goes ahead and does that hard work and licenses a number of these RSPs, and then there's a smaller or less wealthy or less well-equipped with expertise countries somewhere else, and they can be like, I'm sure Canada got it right, let's license those folks as well. So they can essentially free ride on the work that larger countries that have that expertise already and have done the work, they can basically tag along there. So that's kind of nice. Okay. Of course, this is soft harmonization, right? It's not like an international treaty where we can enforce non-compliance, and I think that's a really important point to realize, and felt like they snuck that in there a little bit because they're really reframing what harmonization is about, right? So they couch harmonization in the terms of making it easier for companies to comply across jurisdictions with different standards. That's really what a market-driven approach is looking for, whereas in AI safety circles, international AI governance is more around like, how can we actually make this enforceable so that market actors that are fine with foregoing certain markets still have to comply, right? So it's obviously tricky and an unsolved problem on that side as well, and maybe it's better to have at least this, that you have some harmonization in terms of easing compliance, maybe because this could be a stepping stone towards alignment on an international level. So if you build that regulatory expertise throughout different governments that set different goals, they certainly at least have to like really actively think about these things, and perhaps over time it turns out that some RSPs have a better way to do this, and then there happens some alignment and you ease the path into a sort of like actual AI safety coordination on a global scale. But just be aware of that fact. They sort of see it very much in a competitive market-driven harmonization to ease compliance across jurisdictions. So you might think of that what you will. One other point where I really felt that the authors are specifically focused on sort of the more ordinary risks from AI rather than the most extreme ones that our community here, for example, cares most about, is their point about the ability of this approach to address regulatory disruption. I'm gonna let you read my pretty slide and have a sip of water. So the claim in this light yellow here that the authors are making is basically that regulatory approaches are really fascinated with the shiny new object and the impacts, the novel risks that AI could bring in terms of bias and polarization and so on, and that not sufficient attention is being paid to existing regulatory approaches in sectors such as finance and healthcare and so on, that they expect to be majorly disrupted by AI as well. And so they say that there's a massive benefit that the regulatory markets have over the command and control approach of the one that I presented at the very outset that we generally take today, because regulatory markets have the ability to pull the expertise from these areas in finance, healthcare, transportation, and whatnot into the private regulators. And then the claim there is essentially that these sectorial experts are likely much better equipped than your run-of-the-mill regulator to come up with great ideas of how you could regulate AI in these specific sectors. Okay, so this is they say is a distinct advantage that this model has that the frontier AI safety debate doesn't really account for. Okay, let me stop there as well. Maybe I should have actually on the previous slide already. That was quite a bit. So feel free to ask about that too.
Yeah, so I'm just like curious about this question of the incentives of the regulators, because it seems like one way that this could go wrong is the regulator just like tries to find the like cheapest way to like convince the government that they've satisfied their thing, but like without actually solving the problem that you care about. And yeah, I'm just like not convinced that like cost is like the right thing that they should be optimizing for or something.
Yeah, I have to say I'm kind of with you on that one. There were some examples in the paper that I thought were quite informative of like how high level the standard could be as the authors envision them for the government to set. So they said something like, oh, imagine the autonomous driving industry. A standard or a goal that the government could set is that, oh, it needs to contribute to minimizing congestion. Really tricky to determine whether a private regulator and their approach specifically contributes to that specific goal, especially if you have several regulators that compete with different approaches, because then how do you attribute it to any one of them? So I'm like, I'm not so sure either. The general idea is that it's beneficial that you regulate a group of experts that then do the actual regulation of the frontier companies rather than directly regulating the frontier companies, because implied, I suppose, in there is that maybe it's a little less expertise that you need, but and potentially it's also a smaller set of entities that you have to regulate, right? If you consider thousands of downstream deployers in thousands of different sectors, maybe I'm overstating this a bit, but a number of different sectors that require different expertise, it might be still easier for the government to regulate there. But I think the expertise that government has to do that credibly, so that they can't be cheated, can't be convinced into some sort of like very suboptimal approach to regulating them is considerable. I would agree for sure. Yeah, please. 1 second.
Just curious that this framework that you're proposing, I mean the authors are proposing, do we have parallels if we come outside AI and look at other industries where this kind of model has been applied and applied successfully?
Yeah, actually they bring several examples where they say there is, to an extent, a continuum here. So there is the approach in general that the government regulates intermediaries that are then responsible for regulating the actual actors. Let me see if I remember what they said. I think the concrete example that I recall is if you have like a standard bodies that sets detailed standards, and then the government would simply say what kind of thresholds the standards need to meet. That would be an example. Can anyone from the regulatory space recall where those intermediaries are regulated rather than the actual targets? Like, I specifically recall that there are examples in the paper that I could refer you to, so maybe you have to look that up. for sure. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So for the online audience and for those who perhaps didn't hear, the comment was basically around, well, the tricky thing with AI is that it is applicable and potentially usable in so many domains, right? And so regulatory expertise can hardly cover all of that because it's so different to regulate autonomous vehicles versus like medical devices that use AI. So that makes it difficult. So even if we have sort of blueprints in other industry where this worked, usually they will be very specific. So let's say it was like aircrafts or something where there might be a concrete example. With AI, it was so tricky because it spans all of industry, right? So it would be a massive effort to set up a regulatory market for all possible uses of AI. So maybe we'd start with the most high-risk ones, right? Maybe we can piggyback on the sectorial expertise where this sort of mechanism already exists and sort of like upskill them to also do AI in those specific fields. So this is one of the specific points that they brought forward right here, that sectorial specialists see risks first and potentially are also most useful to devise solutions. So yeah, but it's a massive undertaking that they are proposing, a very, very different approach to what we're doing right now. We're not close, but they say the urgency really requires taking massive bets on normal approaches because what we're doing right now is clearly not working because we're not circumventing any of these issues by taking the approach that we're taking today. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Does the effectiveness or longevity of this model change when you move from democratic governments to non-democratic governments? Because I believe.
Please say that again. If you require what?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my voice is very gone today. Does the effectiveness or longevity of this regulatory market model change between democratic governments and non-democratic governments?
Yeah, so they have a really interesting section in the paper as well where they talk specifically about China, where they say, well, one of the benefits is that you have democratic legitimacy and accountability, right? And maybe that is a bit questionable when the country that you are targeting as a company or as a private regulator can't really be couched in terms of democratic leadership, right? So then the question is, do you have democratic legitimacy on that front? But whether it's sort of like, if it's super authoritarian, I think you run into that issue. If you have sort of like a democracy versus some other functioning form of governance, I think it can work either way as long as they are capitalists. Because yeah, basically the idea here is that market incentives are what we need to generate for the regulatory approach. Some way to match the market incentives for capability development by the incentives for developing regulatory technologies. Yes.
Going back to the question that was asked earlier about if there were any examples of things that have worked, I was just thinking, like, for example, in Canada, we have a public health agency that regulates like food and safety, like restaurants have to pass an inspection, or in the airplane makers or the telecom companies are regulated by like CRTC, for example. So would it not be more efficient to just have a federal agency who would theoretically be these experts regulate AI rather than going through market forces? Like, is this addressed in the paper at all?
They very much imply why that's not a good idea, because they say that the public sector in general can't innovate as the private sector can. And if your goal is to keep pace with AI capability development to match what regulatory technologies can do in terms of evals and procedures around red teaming and control and all those sorts of things, then the public sector is just simply not as powerful and well equipped from an incentive structure as the free market is. So that wouldn't work for that purpose, basically. I think behind the pillar.
So my question is based a little bit about what was covered before, but if you had to take a best guess in how this would practically transpire, would it be existing companies that have experience previously in financial auditing, for example, KPMG, that have those experiences with governments and with corporations transition into this form of new governance, or would it be fresh new companies that specifically specialize in this?
Yeah, I could see a mix of both, basically. So to make clear that was audible, so would it most likely be companies like KPMG tagging on something like this, getting licensed as private regulators, or would it be new companies that break into this field? So given the market size that they seem to be envisioning, I think it has to be a mix of both. And they very much say that competition is really the key driver here, right? So the more populated this market is, the better. And given that they specifically speak about the hope that a lot of VC money would flood into that market, my understanding is that they believe that experts that are currently at frontier companies, for example, or that currently are in these other sectors that are highly regulated, they would come together and see like opportunity for entrepreneurship to start something new. But probably both.
I was kind of thinking about the same thing, and as I'm hearing this, I feel like it has the hallmarks of like the setup for a like global innovation challenge, like X Prize realm of like you put some pots of gold, and maybe it's like thematic or something because we don't have one that crosses all of these yet. But you could imagine it kind of quickly kickstarting the industry, just like the race is on, and it could be like the world's smallest red team suddenly is like the leaders in this, and it gets around the challenge of like you don't have to already know the solution or hire the people or try and decide at the beginning what you want at the end. You like use it to make yourself set the most essential parameters, and then you just like throw money at it. Do you see like potential in that?
I think you
Or
nailed it. Yeah, that sounds
Okay.
very much like the vision that they
if
have.
anyone
Yeah.
here is a millionaire and you want to make the next X Prize on this, like
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I think there's another question there. Yeah.
So, like, just wanted to take a particular example. For example, there's a new agentic standard. It's called AIUC, right? They're also an underwriting company. So what they're doing is they will take your multi-agentic system, help you comply with their standard, and then sell that to anybody else seeking to get insurance or assurance and have a dual business model, charge somebody for the compliance aspect of it with the standard as much as that can be compliant, and then charge somebody else for, you know, whoever they are assuring that this is, you know, something we have attested to. So where does that lie on the spectrum, squarely within, and how does this change, especially how does this work with existing regulators? For example, insurance has regulators, which are government regulators. How does that work with them, or how does this sort of interact directly with your DPAs who are acting as regulators?
Yeah. Okay, so on that first bit, where does it fit into this framework? I think they could be the first innovators in the RSP space, right? What's missing right now is of course the democratic legitimacy. So you have the democratic deficit there because government didn't tell them what goals to meet through the standards that they set. They just came up with it and they're like, we're leaders now, and so I can testify your compliance with whatever I came up with, essentially. So that it doesn't satisfy it yet, but it is, I think, an essential first mover, basically. And then how does it fit with other regulators, perhaps around privacy and so on? So that's a really interesting question. They don't address that, but I mean, to the extent that the laws apply to agents, you would also have to comply with the privacy legislation that applies in the jurisdiction. Is that what you were getting at? I see. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, that's what I was getting at. So what I'm wondering is, in this market, then what do you end up becoming? Do you just become, for example, a certification body, you know, like environmental certifications for, let's say, your Tetra Paks, right?
I think, yeah, basically.
So are you just becoming that? So what that exists already, right? And that it exists across different sectors. So in that space, calling yourself a regulator, what sort of and I haven't read the paper, but it's how does that sort of give the sort of legitimacy that already exists in these markets with standards, ISO, NIST,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I would
What
take it
problem
that
are you solving?
I think what is missing basically is that those standards don't yet account for AI specific risks or the potential ways that AIs could threaten compliance with those things. And the assurance aspect of certifying that AI doesn't is certainly missing because we don't have that regulatory technology yet, right? So yes, it would be a certification body, but one that doesn't yet exist because they don't yet address the risks fully. That's very nascent. Okay, so I want to make this clearer, hopefully, by an example that they bring forth in this paper, where they specifically apply this framework to frontier AI governance, which I was like very happily surprised to see, but I perceived a bit of a tension with the rest of the paper, which seemed to be more focused on fairness and facial recognition and non-discrimination and things like that. But clearly, they also intend for this to apply to the kinds of catastrophic risks that we are concerned about, as they set out this example on biosecurity and red teaming. So here's how they envision this to work in practice. The role of the government would be, again, as we said, to license those RSPs. So they could set a principled-based target, for example, high confidence that the model does not increase capacity of non-state actors to produce bioterror toxins. Then there's an intermediary step here that we didn't yet discuss that goes to the practicality of how to figure out how you can possibly meet this standard. And so the vision here would be that the first step government takes is also the very first step is that they announce a time frame in which they expect a licensed independent red teaming team to be available, and by what time evaluation companies need to be able to do this, and by what time the AI company needs to purchase these regulatory services. So maybe, I don't know, 2 years or something, they don't say, but some sort of timeline. And then the next step would be to set out those licensing criteria, like this, for example. And then to figure out how this should work in practice, they suggest that the government could form an expert group that determines what the specific standard is. So to move a bit further away from just the principle-based to a standard. So they would have to figure out what does high confidence mean, right? Because this is very much an abstract term that you wouldn't really know what to do with. And then they see this basically as an iterative process where this expert group would convene the frontier AI companies and try to figure out what is feasible, what can the technology do. So there's basically a back and forth between those two entities to define these standards further. And so they would also vice versa provide guidance to the frontier companies that they anticipate would want to purchase those regulatory services, so to put them into a position to comply, right? Because if you just drop that on them, then what can you do? You will have to fail if you haven't first thought about how you can possibly comply with these standards. And then there would be an iterative process where you can specify what these standards are supposed to look like over time. So the government wouldn't be pinned down to setting the standard once, and the regulator wouldn't be pinned down to setting the standard once. They can iterate on this as they learn more of how this works. And then the frontier companies have to contract with these red team providers, and the market essentially then drives the capacity. Right? You have the commercial opportunity, influx of money, and then established companies, for example, Meter or Apollo. Those are nonprofits that do evaluations of frontier companies. They could spin into a for-profit, generate further influx of investment. As for-profit evaluators. So that is one possible pathway to how this could happen, basically. Okay, and then we have an overview of the opportunities and risks. I think we talked through most of them, but let's see. So essentially, on the opportunity side, building regulatory technology at the pace of AI. That's like the prime goal of this entire approach. We need to match the incentives for AI capability development with incentives for the development of regulatory technology in this space. And we need to have this at scale, and ideally globally, right? So that you can get licensed by different jurisdictions across the globe. We have the possibility of recruiting experts from their specific domains to inform the most fitting and suitable technologies, essentially. Oh yeah, one point that they make that I didn't mention yet is that this incentivizes paying attention to regulatory disruption. So disruption of, saying, licensing drugs or something, massively disrupted by AI and probably many different areas as well. And often there's an incentive by government to just like close their eyes there and be like, oh, what we have applies to AI just fine, and it doesn't. And so if you have expertise from the ground to populate private regulators, there's an incentive to actually pay attention to that. So this seems to be a major area where the authors are concerned. And then, as we mentioned, it reduces cross-jurisdictional compliance burdens. This is the harmonization stuff that I talked about. On the risk side, so regulatory capture is a problem. So the RSPs would compete for their clients, who are also the ones that pay them. So there's potentially a structural pressure towards leniency. We discussed the independence already in response to a question earlier, so that there might be legal mechanisms that you can apply to address that to an extent. One issue that I also mentioned several times now is that there's potential for lax government oversight if they don't have the funding or the expertise to oversee these regulators properly, if they don't have the ability to credibly threaten with the revocation of a license because they just can't understand what's going on, then that's a problem. So you need to credibly threaten. Lack of political will or funding in general is an issue, right? So if a jurisdiction just doesn't see the need to regulate in this particular manner or at all because they think it stifles innovation, this system doesn't really help you overcome it, other than saying, but look at the market that you could create here, right? If regulatory markets are billion-dollar opportunities, then maybe that helps a little bit, but maybe it doesn't. Another point that the authors mentioned too is that this competition of private regulators could render the space even more complex and opaque for governments to understand, because there might be very many different approaches of how you can verify compliance or assess the achievement of the goals that government sets, right? And so that might make it very difficult for the government to understand. It might potentially simpler when the government says, this is what you have to do, this is the goal you have to achieve, AI company, and this is how you do it. And then they just need to develop expertise in this one particular method. This way, complexity might be enhanced. And then an important point is that the vision that they have for competition among the private regulators might not play out the way that they envision it, because there might be insufficient scale. So specifically in the frontier model context, if you have only a handful or maybe a dozen frontier companies, maybe that doesn't give rise to a sufficiently large market to really drive that competition that is so essential for this model to work. Okay, questions on this? Yes.
Hi, I thought there might be a bit of a contradiction, because if we go in from the premise that the people in government and the bureaucracy are always going to be a bit slower, a bit less competent, a bit duller, a bit less, a bit dumber effectively, then how are they expected to hold the reins, so to speak, on this market system once it's established? Because you're already presuming the people outside of government are going to be a bit smarter, a bit sharper, a bit more competent, and so on. Aren't they going to be the ones holding the reins in reverse, so to speak?
Okay, I don't accept the framing on the record that they're a bit dumber in government. Certainly I do not. If you look at the competence of the folks at the European AI office, for example, they are absolutely on par with what you find internally at frontier companies. So I hear your point, though, that generally the funding constraints of governments potentially make it difficult because you don't have VC money flooding in, right? You don't have the same competition incentives to innovate. That stands, right? So the result, certainly, despite what the starting point in terms of smarts or expertise might be, they seem to lag behind in the capability of having deploying the technical expertise to oversee the regulator. I completely agree with you. I think that is probably the main challenge, that you need still a very high level of expertise at the level of the government to oversee and regulate, incredibly threaten the revocation of licenses for these regulators. I am not yet convinced that it is a lower level of expertise that is necessary to regulate the regulator than to regulate the companies. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe TBD, we'll see. We'll take a bet on this and see how it works. Perhaps at least there's that argument about the sectoral expertise, where can you draw people with the domain expertise in that then explain to the government really clearly how this works, and the government is less concerned about this being lobbying, right? Because there are not the same market incentives to just drive capabilities forward and not paying attention to safety. Their mandate would really be safety, except of course for the fact that they're paid by the companies that they have to regulate. So that's certainly a problematic dynamic right there. So I think you have certainly a point there that I do agree with, yeah.
In my experience, typically those who seek to be regulators are more often like power seeking rather than fairness seeking. But putting the incentives of wanting to be a regulatory body aside, what are other legal strategies or acts that could be passed to put the burden of reporting on these model labs? Like the Sarbanes-Oxley created the identity management software category because it required rules for companies to report on who had financial control and access. What about interventions at that level that enforce how, with each new type of product or model release, even at like the deployment level, at the customer level, AI companies have to report how their technologies are being used? Because a consequence of increased regulation has been that these companies just stay private for longer with more capital, not less.
Yeah, I don't see another incentive other than regulation mandates it and does so credibly through the threat of considerable fines and market access restrictions, essentially, right? So if you don't report to me how your system works and what safety evaluations you employed and what the results that were, and you don't provide me with your external auditor report on these things that gives me additional trust into what you say, you can't be on my market, right? So that's the approach that the EU takes, that takes a bet on its sheer market size to say, you will have an incentive to sell your products on my market, therefore I can dictate the terms that you apply to show compliance with my laws, essentially, yeah. But that's the only way to do it, yeah.
Yeah, over here. My question is around accountabilities. With this model, I think what I'm now getting, it's around, let's just say, we implement this model and then a AI company, their product end up harming whether a person or a community. How does that being addressed? Like, what's the thinking around by author, but also your own experience?
Yeah, to the best of my recollection, they don't address it. I can tell you that the organization I work for, the Future Society, when we were involved in shaping what the AI Act and the Code of Practice, which is the mechanism that frontier companies can use to demonstrate compliance with the AI Act, when we were involved in shaping that process, one of our proposals was to say, you need essentially a shared liability regime between external auditors, the equivalent of our private regulators here, and the companies, right? So that you have to put money where your mouth is, essentially, when you attest as a private regulator that yes, they meet these standards, you have the additional deterrent essentially in the background that, well, if it turns out that you didn't follow your internal procedures properly, that it was foreseeable for you, that you were potentially negligent, or that you were colluding with the AI company, that it hits you hard if a harm happens. So I think it would be a wonderful addition to this mechanism to say there's joint liability in those instances, but I don't think it's specifically addressed.
I was also wondering, you mentioned that the process of standard setting would be iterative, but I was wondering if like it would be a continuous process of standard setting. I'm wondering if the authors talk about whether that process of principle making would also be continuous. And I'm just thinking, with the AI Act example, for instance, you had this general principle that like meaningful transparency would also help to ensure kind of compliance. But meaningful transparency might mean something different in like an agentic AI situation
Yeah.
than it did when they were developing that initial principle in the act itself. Do the authors kind of talk about how those principles themselves might sort of change in meaning, or is it just about the standards?
So I think that they most closely address this on this slide, where they say there could be this expert group with sort of like feedback between all the different parties that would mutually inform what's going on. If you do say simply meaningful transparency, you can say, well, that's as future-proof as it gets, because depending on what the new technology is, it's maybe harder for them to do meaningful transparency because there's continuous learning or whatnot in the agent context, but it still has to be meaningful. And then it's the private regulator that needs to come up with a mechanism to prove compliance with this standard. And then the government can say yay or nay for this new technology, essentially. So I would say, yeah, there is room for iteration, but principle-based governance is useful in that way because you can say fairness, and then that can mean a billion things, and someone else has to specify it. Yeah. It's more tricky on the standard level, right? When you get down to the technical nitty-gritty.
Yeah. So, thanks, by the way, for facilitating this conversation, because very valuable. I'm just wondering, have we really thought ahead? And I'm my no means a techie when it comes to this technology stuff, but as I understand it, we're now in the midst of really going full into agentic technologies, and the next wave of that is going to be agents working with other agents, so multi-agent type applications. What happens when those multi-agents start going cross borders? Because that's going to obviously happen at some point in the future. Have we thought that far ahead when it comes to forming these type of frameworks?
Yeah, good call. I don't recall that they addressed that specifically. It seems to me, though, that as a design question, this model would be better addressed to deal with that than the approach we're currently taking, where countries regulate separately, and also where they regulate the entities separately, right? So usually the way it works, at least in my domain under the AI Act, you have an obligation that applies to every single provider, but there's no obligation to say, and all of providers need to come together, have a sandbox run through of their AI agents to see how they interact in practice, and then they have to render a collective report or something. Because in those systems where you have interacting agentic systems, no single provider has the whole picture, because they just don't know how they would react with the other agent, because their capabilities and their behavior might shape how your own agent reacts, right? So that's a structural issue that we're facing today already. I think this approach, because of this vision that you can have regulators that are certified across jurisdictions, but basically they're envisioned to be licensed by different jurisdiction, you might facilitate that kind of collaboration between providers, right? If you build a trusting relationship by one private regulator with different providers, then perhaps they can pull in the information into one entity, maybe run that sort of testing. So government could be in a position to say, well, if you want to be licensed, you need to figure out how you govern multi-agentic systems that interact in the wild. And then you have an incentive on the market to figure out how that's supposed to work. So I don't think they specifically address it and have thought that far ahead, but if you put me on the spot, I can maybe see a pathway there. Okay, I think I got one more slide. Yeah, so a couple of open questions that came to me when I read this. So one thing is this sort of like expert group accountability question that already came up here. There are examples in the regulatory space where governments just dropped the ball hard and actually they didn't do a good job overseeing the entities that they were supposed to regulate. So what assures us that we don't have that issue here? It plays also into that question of how do we ensure that capability is actually present at the government level? So that seems problematic there. And then one other thing that I thought about was, so we do have in the frontier AI space already a number of companies that do evals and that have invested quite a bit in building a trusting relationship with frontier companies that currently voluntarily solicit their services to get them to evaluate their models ahead of launch, basically. If you turn this into a mandatory system, I wonder if that dynamic between the existing companies that currently already have the expertise might become a little bit dicey, because then they're themselves considered as the regulator. If you look at the dynamic, for example, the AI Security Institute in the UK, they were awarded access to Mythos Preview, for example. They were able to test it. They don't have a regulatory function. The AI office did not get that access, although they would also have a mandate to test and evaluate those systems, right? So maybe that gives you a hint of a potential change in the dynamic when these evaluating companies were to turn into private regulators. And then about the application in general of this framework to the frontier. So clearly they intend that, because otherwise why would this biosecurity example of red teaming of frontier models be in there? But I'm not quite sure whether it works, specifically from that competitive perspective that I already mentioned, right? So if there are so few frontier companies, will there be really that many evaluators? Wouldn't one capture the largest market share and then there you go, and you don't have that great innovation cycle and that sort of pressure to innovate and to come up with better technologies? I'm not so sure. So it seems like there's a bit of a structural tension. Perhaps the author disagreed amongst themselves, and one felt like, yes, it can do it, and the other maybe not so much, or they just had different focus areas. So if you read that a bit sensitively, that seemed to me to be a bit of a tension there. Curious to hear if something else came up for you guys. Otherwise, that would be it from my end. Okay, we have. Thank you. One sec.
So one of the things that I've noticed is that there's been instances where AI governance or AI security hasn't played a big part or had caused something bad to happen. Case in point, I don't remember the name of the town, but somewhere in BC where the gunman basically inputted in his prompt that he was looking to kill someone or commit a mass murder or suicide or whatever the case is. Do you think the reason why there's not a lot of venture capitalists or people looking to invest in an AI governance company is because of the fact that AI innovation wouldn't move as fast if there's something stopping it or barriers, telling it to kind of like hold back when they want to, push forward?
Yeah, so it's a fairly classic argument, right? That there is a perceived tension between innovation and governance. This argument that if you do regulate, if you do apply any obligations on AI providers, be it system or model providers, then you make it harder for them to ship their model at the speed that they can, if compared to if they were able to cut corners on safety. And so I guess on its own, it's not that lucrative to invest into regulatory technology because it doesn't immediately generate a strong bottom line, unless you really incentivize this market to be created, right? Because once you oblige AI providers to pay their private regulators and they provide a highly valuable service and there's great expertise there, then that can be a large market. And the incentive for society in general to invest there, I think makes a lot of sense, because we currently have very unreliable AI that is not yet suitable to be integrated in the economy on a large scale for the most part, right? So there's hesitancy from the industry side to really lean into AI. Certainly we see that in Canada, right? Lots of skepticism around this. And so if you were able to build AI systems in a way that are amenable to assurance, to insurance, to trust in the end, then I think you can unlock great potential for AI to be integrated in these sectors. So I think there is, and there have been studies done on this, that there is a big market in sort of like high risk applications that is not tapped into because there is just simply not the level of reliability that we need. So I think if we can make a change there, that can draw a lot of investment. But I agree with the authors that you would need additional help from the government to create that market. We do have a question here in the front. Perfect.
Just on that note, I'm not sure that it is that the AI companies always have an incentive to push the frontier forward if they can all agree to not push it forward. Like there has been examples. I forget it was in one of the previous talks. I forget if it was Anthropic or ChatGPT, but they actually didn't release one of their models explicitly because they did not want to push the frontier forward. Like the heads of these AI companies know that there is danger in pushing the frontier forward, but there is a profit motive to be like if the frontier is going to be pushed forward, there is a profit motive and an incentive to be the first one to push it forward. So I'm not necessarily sure that I'm not necessarily as cynical, I think, and maybe that's deserved and maybe it's not. That these AI companies are going to coordinate to like try and not be regulated as long as they're all sort of being regulated.
Yeah, so there were certainly statements that some of these leaders of these companies have made where they said that, well, if we could just all stop simultaneously, we would all do it. The issue is the coordination problem, right? So it was Anthropic that deliberately did not release Mythos publicly, right? Because it said, oh, its capabilities are so massive. But then OpenAI claimed that GPT 5.5 had comparable capabilities, and they decided to release it, right? So it's like, do you want to take the bet that they are always behaving responsibly, or do you want to have government oversight? Like, I know where I would fall. Yeah. Yeah, true. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. A question kind of related to the last two. You mentioned earlier the idea of shared legal responsibility when things go wrong, that it would make sense for regulators to have some liability for mistakes. I was wondering, does this also offer another avenue to having private regulation, even if the government doesn't require AI systems to be licensed? So, for example, you can imagine if legislation is passed that makes it very clear that AI companies will be liable for harms legally, you would imagine, well, maybe they would then write contracts with insurance companies who would then be a sort of regulator because the insurance company wants to make sure that the models they're insuring are not going to lead to big lawsuits against them.
Great question. That's the talk I gave, I think, 4 weeks ago about AI insurance as a potential private regulatory mechanism that could be complementary to public regulation. I think it's a great idea. It's not mine either. But the issue that you have there is currently the risk quantification is so hard, right? We just don't have the data yet as you would have to base your fire insurance or car accidents insurance model on. So that actuarial science just hasn't developed because we haven't had those incidents yet, specifically the ones at the catastrophic scale. I mean, thank God, but also bad for that business model, right? So what you can do there is to really incentivize incident reporting, including near misses. So observations from your testing environment, as Anthropic, for example, often publishes it voluntarily already, like the blackmail example and all these sorts of things, right? That can be an initial data set that helps develop in this direction. But yeah, we need to do better on benchmarks and evaluations to make sure we can in some way quantify the risks from AI so that you can build a business model from an insurance company on that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then I'll ask one more question and then pass this on. One thing I was wondering a little bit about is open source models that might be developed decentrally. So we see this with a lot of very important software used for the internet and other things, that you have developers around the world working together to develop something, even though there's no organization really in charge. Yeah. Can those kinds of AI systems be regulated in this way, or does it just not work?
So for the authors, it's in scope, but they don't address that very specifically of the challenges that would arise there. I mean, one thing you can do is like, you can have an entity that you appoint to be in charge despite the decentralized development modus, essentially, right? And then you say, well, and you're the one that, and obviously they would have some sort of incentive that we need to create. But the tricky thing is if you don't have an organization that has the funds to pool to then pay a private regulator, I find it structurally difficult of how that's supposed to work. I think open source in a way where it's centrally developed is easier, but potentially the decentralized development model hasn't been considered here at all. Yeah, I think not. Good point. More? Yeah, 2 more here in the front. Thank you, Georgia.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering, in my eyes, I'm trying to correlate this with existing frameworks. So I'm thinking accounting or audits in the financial sphere. And I guess companies a lot of the times have a monetary incentive to cut corners or to hide funds, for instance. But with AI, at least to my understanding, bias and such can actually be it could take away from the profit margins of a company. It could negatively be a detriment. So is there, I guess, in the long run, in the short run, I completely understand the need for this, but in the long run, as there's a lot of iteration and as companies improve how biased their models may be, it could kind of plateau the growth of the potential industry in the future. Is that a possibility?
The growth of the industry of the private regulator, you mean? Ah, okay. Yeah. Interesting. Like to me, I currently have little faith into market forces to incentivize sufficiently on AI safety. If you look at the sheer numbers of the investment into capabilities versus safety mechanisms, it's dwarfed. Like, I don't know, 200x or something crazy like that. I fully agree that what is your use case in real world applications if your system is not sufficiently reliable? But I mean, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have that silver bullet use case of general purpose AI that would justify the enormous incentives. But the promise is that it replaces all work, and that's the biggest item on your balance sheet generally, right? So it's that sort of like vague faith into that happening at some point that drives these investments, and then you need to ensure your investors that you can make a return on their investment. And how do you do that? By capturing market share and indicating how much your user base grows month over month, right? And so currently you have just the wrong incentives because of the private investment flooding in. And so I think market incentives are currently just not cutting it, right? So that's, I think, the problem I see there. Whether that can plateau at some point in the future where regulators don't have anything to do anymore because you have that plateau and everybody behaves properly. I mean, that would be great, I think. And you might still want certification mechanism to signal consumer trust at that point to ensure that you don't start having some sort of like free riders that fall through the cracks. But maybe, I think that is probably a very distant future problem we might have to deal with at some point.
So my question probably gonna go back to 10 years ago when we have like digital communication technology. Just to give you a background where my question coming from. So I was working in the federal government at the time. We requested algorithm from those companies and they denied giving us their algorithm. And then later you see what's happening as it evolves, where they're like, oh, we're a platform, so we're not really responsible for harm. So I think where my question is going, it's around what's the threshold of like, if we don't do anything now, at which point in the future that we actually gonna be seeing similar behavior as the digital communication technology that we're dealing with right now?
So just a stance of non-cooperation with government, essentially?
No, more like if we don't regulate now or introduce any act or legislation or regulation to, or even this model to the AI model, the AI company, when is that inaction going to become an issue?
Well, I think it's an issue now, right? It's an issue with the harms that are materializing today, which are non-negligible, right? We're not yet on that sort of like catastrophic scale that this community is particularly concerned with. But if you look at like the suicide cases, the mass shooting that was that was mentioned earlier. Those are the early and already really significant signs that something is going pretty wrong. There's always this touchy phrase where someone says like a sandwich is more highly regulated than AI system that has this general applicability across industry and that can run havoc. So to me, that is quite striking, right? So if we feel like it's necessary to protect the public from food poisoning through whatever, something going wrong in the way that you make a sandwich at a restaurant, then maybe we should also have the regulatory stamina to regulate AI. If we do already see real life incidents basically on a considerable scale everywhere. So I think there's not a specific point in the future where it's like, oh, and now it's too late. I would say like the capacity that we need to build this, I think this drove that home really well. It's like there's a lot of upskilling to do on every level, right? The government level, but also private companies that are able to regulate these companies, to do evals properly and all those things. And so I think that the time is well, yesterday, really. Yeah. Okay, last question.
All right. This is maybe a bit of a naive or pie in the sky kind of question, but in developmental economics, technology is the way that emerging markets go from, for example, like agricultural societies to manufacturing and so on. And so you mentioned how you can take through kind of market forces, countries that can't afford to regulate themselves, kind of outsource that to other countries. How do you ensure that that extra cost of regulation doesn't stifle the stimulation of like the one-man company or one person company and those sorts of things that could allow emerging markets to go into like larger or more powerful economies? And furthermore, like historically, of course this is debated, but for example in the American Revolution, tea regulation essentially started the war. And so how do you ensure that this regulation brings more peace than conflict when it's one regulator, private regulators in one country regulating the companies in another?
Yeah, I think I'm basically left to say I have to stay humble on responding to that question. I don't know if I have the answers there. I think there are so many unresolved design questions of successfully establishing such a regulatory system that we haven't solved yet. But the best we can do is sort of like try to carefully iterate, but also at a speed that sort of matches the capability development, which is a really, really tricky thing to do if you want to do the one thing wisely. But on the other side, you have potential lunatics that are just racing ahead. It's like really, really tricky. I do hear your point, though, that there is something really important about innovation, specifically for countries that are yet not on par with developed industries, right? And to make sure that we don't have that capture essentially in the Western world, I think is something that needs to be absolutely considered. I wonder whether there's some sort of tiering that you could apply in this regulatory model where you have perhaps government programs that facilitate compliance, or lower pricing perhaps if you don't meet a certain threshold in terms of your market cap, something like that you would have to carefully think through. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was all very informative. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. Okay, very last question. I think you were just very keen to. Yes. Sorry, one sec. If you wait for the mic, perfect.
Okay, so I have a bit of a background in medtech and contracting with the military. So I guess an observation is regulatory markets in some form or another have existed for like a long time. Like hospitals go to private companies to get certification. There are medical devices that do the same thing. Defense, cybersecurity, the DoD doesn't do the certification. Companies have to go to private certifiers. So the claim here is basically just like we need the same standards for AI. This just seems like trivially a good thing. This is like not that big of a thing. It's just like trivially a good idea is like an observation. Second thing is, let's see here. I was curious, so I asked Claude, how did these regulatory agencies start?
The regulatory what? Sorry?
Regulatory markets.
Yeah.
Regulatory markets start. The existence of private certificate activity usually always predates the government stepping in and doing something. So
correct me if I'm wrong, then like the idea here is that the government likely won't act, so like a private company needs to basically step up where the government doesn't act, because historically the government only acts after a catastrophe occurs.
Mhm.
Like financial auditing as we know it only occurred after Enron.
Mhm.
The maritime safety regulation that created an entire regulatory market there only occurred after the Titanic. And the list goes on.
Mhm.
And in cases where there wasn't a catastrophe that drove the government to act, there was a pre-existing regulatory market already, and that kind of gave legitimacy to the government to like set laws.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know. Is there anything I'm missing? It just seems kind of trivially a good idea.
So you're missing. Why hasn't this happened yet? I guess if it's truly a good idea, like what's so hard to actually implement it, right?
Yeah, I'm largely pushing back against like skepticism I heard in the room. I don't really understand the skepticism. I
Okay,
suppose.
good. So a hopeful comment to end on. I love that. that's wonderful. Thanks everybody. I really appreciated the interactions. Okay, so you have another 15 minutes to ask Catherine any questions that you want to ask her. But please still feel free to stick around a little longer. We'll be here until 9 so that you guys can chat with each other, discuss the presentation, and make some friends. Okay.
I had like right semester in the winter. Oh, man. Come on. Keep it crazy. It's crazy. Okay, awesome. Yeah. You're too though. Yeah. But yeah, no. Oh, really? Oh, I really? That's also. Your car. I know that. Yeah.